On the 27th of March, the Coffee House Shots team will be joined by special guests to give you their take on the spring statement. We will be live on stage at London's Cadogan Hall. To get your tickets today, visit spectator.co.uk/coffeehouselive. We'll see you there.
If you have a Labour government listening to trade unions headed by people who have been or are avowed Trotskyites, and one of them is someone who's never even taught in a school, then what you have is Keir Starmer's government being driven by ideology, not by evidence on education, and that runs counter to what he's seeking to do in almost every other area of policy.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale. I'm joined today by Michael Gove, the editor of The Spectator, and Amanda Spielman, former head of Ofsted. Now, Michael, first of all, the Children's Welfare Bill, or Education Bill, returns to Parliament this week. Tell us where we stand at the beginning of this, and Labour doesn't seem to be looking like they're going to make many concessions, do they?
No. So the bill is a bill of two halves, as it were. It's both a schools bill and a well-being bill. The second half, the well-being measures, are broadly uncontentious. Some of them deal with children who are taken out of school and homeschooled and making sure that there are appropriate safeguards in place. And there are some other measures which are broadly welcomed. But the schools element is deeply contentious. And that's because the government wants to significantly alter the landscape, particularly with respect to academies and particularly with respect to how underperforming schools are tackled. And there are a range of provisions which the opposition and critics, including myself, have taken exception to, one of which restricts the growth of good schools, another of which leaves it uncertain what will happen to underperforming schools. Will they be taken into the hands of academy trusts, and will the people who have real expertise in turning around underperforming schools continue to have that opportunity? And also there are restrictions on everything from the number of items of branded uniform that a school can require of its students, through to ultimately requiring all academy schools to follow the national curriculum. The last element of that is particularly concerning because we don't know what is going to happen to the national curriculum. A review of the national curriculum has been ordered by Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary. It's being led by an academic, Becky Francis. There are some indications that some of the changes that have been made in order to introduce a greater degree of rigour, particularly in core academic subjects, may be dispensed with. All of these changes together are a step away from the broad consensus of where education policy should be ever since Tony Blair was Prime Minister, actually preceding that. And that has caused disquiet, particularly because the government has shown very little interest in listening to its critics. Its approach has been to rubbish them rather than to engage with them so far.
Amanda, I mean, you experienced this over the weekend when you wrote an excellent piece of The Telegraph talking about some of your concerns. What do you think is motivating Labour behind this bill? And have you been surprised, perhaps, at some of the briefing against you?
I haven't been entirely surprised, but I felt it was really important to say that the accumulation of changes through the bill and elsewhere do seem to add up, firstly, to a significant shift towards policy to please unions. And unions, of course, have an agenda about the adults in the school, first and foremost, their members. And I do worry about rebalancing the system in favour of the adults over the children. And the second point I think that can be made is a move away from evidence-based policy. It's striking that all of these changes and restrictions on academies, there's been no sort of serious systematic evaluation of which bits of giving schools and academy trusts autonomy are working well and which bits might need tweaking. Similarly, we haven't yet seen any sort of real systematic evaluation of how the curriculum freedom that academies have has been used, where it's been used well, where it's been used less well. I would have expected that to come before changes as sweeping as this.
And Michael, I suppose what do you think are the elements of the academies that maybe do need requiring fixing? I mean, for instance, I think it was striking that over the weekend there was, some of the Labour-friendly papers have been talking about some of the high pay paid to head teachers. I mean, do you think that's an area where there's legitimate cause for concern, perhaps, or do you think that really that only a few issues have been seized upon and blown up into this piece of legislation that isn't really required?
I fear it's more the latter. I think Amanda's right. There's been no real theory of change here. So there's been no case that's been made by the government, whether in speeches or in a white or green paper, which analyses what's right and what's wrong in our education system. I think that there are problems that do need fixing in our education system. They relate specifically, of course, to the treatment of children with special educational needs, the fact that there are some parts of our country where progress has been painfully slow in school improvement, and also there are understandable concerns about recruitment within the profession, relating broadly to other challenges in the labour market, but still real issues here. But there's been no systematic attempt by the government to explain what it considers to be the real weaknesses and why this legislation is the answer. And I think the question of the chief executives of multi-academy trusts or top head teachers being paid significant sums is a bit of a red herring, because if you have someone like Sir Dan Moynihan, who is the chief executive of the Harris Academy Trust, one of the best performing school chains in the country, then in my view, he almost can't be paid too much, because he's transforming the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of children. And payment for success is a good thing in the public or the private sector. What really should be the case is not a focus on remuneration for a few individuals. It's what changes help the mass of students to do better. And again, every minister, myself included, will have some degree of vanity as they look back at the things that they enacted. And it's always necessary to have a new government or a new administration look with clear eyes at the legacy that it inherited. But if you're going to make changes on this scale, then I think that you need to have an overall justification. That's not there. And some of the statistics that the government uses to make its case, and they're used fitfully and sporadically, relate to the fact that there are a number of academies that are still requires improvement or inadequate, according to Ofsted judgments. There are two things about that. The first thing is that many of these schools were local authority maintained schools that have become academies. So they're the schools which are at the beginning of their journey of transformation and improvement. The second thing is that the government themselves said that one word, Ofsted judgments, did not do justice to the complexity of the performance of any particular school. I do disagree with that. But more than that, they're using these judgments to castigate the last government for there being 600 or so schools that have stayed stuck at the requires improvement level. So they're attacking the last government for failing schools by a metric that they themselves say doesn't do justice to what's really happening in our school system. It's that incoherence which is the most frustrating thing.
And Amanda, I mean, if this bill passes, and it looks like, given the mood we've talked about of the Labour ministers and their advisors, and given the majority in Parliament, what do you think is likely to happen to schools over the next course of this Parliament?
Well, as I said in my Telegraph piece, if we look abroad, we can see other countries where some excellent reforms have been reversed when a government of a different flavour comes in. And the consequences are pretty predictable. If you shift the system towards an agenda that's designed to please unions will always like greater centralisation, for example. They have the most clout in a system that is most directly controlled by government at the centre. There's actually another interesting angle that I haven't seen anybody pick up on, which is that intervention is going to get, in weak schools, is going to get increasingly politicised, because whether or not it's the right thing to do to hook it directly onto Ofsted overall inspection judgments, now it's completely uncertain. Some findings and some data will land on the desk of a civil servant somewhere in DfE. And without speaking to the school directly, without speaking to the inspector, they will have to make a decision with an eye to the minister. There'll be ministerial civil servants and what might please the minister. And of course, there'll be lots and lots of lobbying to avert interventions and consequences that people don't want. So I think we could see the whole system get much more bogged down in challenges to DfE decisions as well as to inspection. We could see just a real morass emerge.
And I think Amanda's absolutely spot on, and this point was made right at the beginning of the introduction of this legislation by the Labour MP Siobhan McDonagh. Siobhan pointed out that at the moment, if a school falls below a certain threshold, then its transformation into an academy is automatic. And there have been cases in the past where when that situation was not in place, placing a local authority school into an academy trust led to protests, judicial review, uncertainty for the children. Whereas the certainty of going into a high-performing academy trust means that the process of transformation can be accelerated and the schools can benefit and the students critically can benefit more quickly. So this legislation, if enacted as it is, will introduce uncertainty where there's certainty, and it will slow or potentially even put into reverse the path of improvement. So why is the government doing this? Well, again, as Amanda points out, this change was a key demand of the trades unions because from their point of view, they want to stymie this process of academisation because they want centralised control over pay and conditions, and they want the academy movement stopped in its tracks. And it is striking that a Labour government is not listening to playwrights like Siobhan McDonagh, but instead is listening to the trade union movement. What's even more concerning is that Daniel Kabidi, who's the head of the leading teachers' union, the NEU, is an avowed Trotskyite. His words, not mine. And the person who's about to become, if reports to believe, the head of the second largest teaching union, the NASUWT, is someone called Matt Rack, who's not a teacher. He's a former firefighter, a former head of the FBU, who in the 1980s was a member of Militant Tendency alongside Derek Hatton. Now, I'm sure he's a lovely chap, but the one thing that worries me is that if you have a Labour government listening to trade unions headed by people who have been or are avowed Trotskyites, and one of them is someone who's never even taught in a school, then what you have is Keir Starmer's government being driven by ideology, not by evidence on education, and that runs counter to what he's seeking to do in almost every other area of policy.
And that principle of grounding policy in evidence, and there've been some really good evolutions. I picked up on the teacher training standards and the early career framework as examples of good evidence-based policy, where putting them under review has just created a great uncertainty about what's going to happen in future. I think this principle of drawing on the body of evidence is a really important one.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.